police controlled the story. They created the story.
They seized on the fears of the people, wilding the bestial characterization of the black man.
There's no DNA match whatsoever to any of these boys.
I was going nuts. No blood on the kids. Nobody could identify them, but if they confessed, and that was that.
That a clip from the Ken Burns documentary about the Central Park Five. 5 teenagers convicted of raping the Central Park jogger in 1989. Then you throw in prison until their convictions were overturned. Even Donald Trump made himself a part of the story back then, and he's doing it again now. And in the case that's back in the news, we also have a Netflix series about the case that has just been released. Our own Dominic Carter, he now brings us a story.
Where did you see the lady?
One lady.
The female jogger was severely beaten and raped.
Every black male who was in the park last night is a suspect. I need all of them.
Since the premiere of the hard-hitting Netflix series When They See Us, one former prosecutor on the so-called Central Park 5 case, Linda Fairstein, just this month, resigned from several boards and was dropped by her book publisher. The other prosecutor, Elizabeth Lederer, resigned from her job at the Columbia University Law School. He is what one of the 5 young men, Raymond Santana, told us at the time of the settlement from the city of New York of $41 million.
Since '89, I have never been in that park. Back in 1990, we was the worst human beings on the planet Earth.
The case was a flashpoint in New York City race relations. In media accounts, the young men were called a wolf pack and super predators. All of them charged in Central Park that 1989 night, African American or Latino. The victim, a white 28-year-old investment banker who was severely beaten, raped, and left for dead. She had lost a ton of blood and had a fractured skull with no memory of the attack. The jogger barely survived. DNA evidence found at the scene of the crime didn't match any of the 5 teens who served between 6 and 13 years in prison. The convictions were overturned after a serial violent offender, Mateus Reyes, confessed to the attack and said he had acted alone. Corey Wise, Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, and Yusef Salam, then aged between 14 and 16, were arrested and interrogated for hours without access to lawyers or their parents. They confessed to the crime, but later recanted.
They saw you rape the lady.
I didn't see a lady or hit anyone. I didn't see any lady.
Kevin.
I didn't see any lady.
I want to see my son right now, right now.
It was coercion, it was trickery. They used everything in the book against us. You know, the taking away of the basic necessities. You know, the sleep, no water, you know, being in a room over 15, 30 hours under questioning. It's cold in there.
How long were you in a room when this happened by police and the district attorney's office?
There's estimated that I was in there over 15 to 30 hours.
In one room?
Yes.
With no food?
No food.
And no sleep?
No sleep. When you walk into something that's unknown, you don't know what's going to happen to you. You feel at this point that the police can kill you and get away with it. As we see, it happens all the time.
Back then, the president wasn't a candidate for office, but he too was a flashpoint with the Central Park case, with his full-page ad calling for the death penalty.
You know, this was the man who put out a full-page ad to give us the death penalty. And we're talking about 14 and 15-year-old kids. He wanted to kill us. You know, now we've been exonerated. He comes back, you know, all these years later, he still says we're guilty. It's pathetic. You know, sometimes you gotta feel sorry for a person like that because of their way of thinking is so twisted.
You have people on both sides of that. They admitted their guilt. If you look at Linda Fairstein and if you look at some of the prosecutors, they think that the city should never have settled that case. So we'll leave it at that.
Santana says he is not interested in meeting with the president unless it comes with an apology, something he says is unlikely to ever happen.
Let me tell you right now, Corey, okay? This is very, very serious.
But it's Corey Wise who perhaps faced the most difficult time of the 5. Wise has a disability and wasn't even initially a suspect, instead coming in to stand by his friend Yusef Salam. The other 4 started serving their time at a youth facility, but because Wise was 16 at the time, he went straight to adult prison, starting with Rikers, and was subject to brutal violence, and then to save his own life, placed in solitary confinement for long periods of time.
Let's bring in Dominic now, and also our legal panel. Let's introduce them. Jim Kasuris, criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, sitting on the board of directors of the New York City Criminal Bar Association. He also frequently lectures at New York Law School and the bar associations in both Queens and New York City. Doug Von Oist, a founding partner of Carson Von Oist, focusing on corporate misconduct, also selected by the Legal 500, one of the most influential trial lawyers in the country, and Mayo Bartlett, an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLC and a former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office, all 3 former assistant district attorneys in their own right. Dom, let's unpack some parts about the story, and then we'll talk about the legal of this. When we talk about that time period, we have viewers who are watching us in D.C. and in Boston and Philly. I mean, we remember the drumbeat of this daily, every day, and not just the Taz, but everyone else. We learned the term wilding, etc. It can't be overhyped just how, in many ways, that brutal attack on that poor jogger in Central Park was the tipping point for many. And they said no more. And they were looking for somebody. They got given these 5 kids. The Wildings was popular at the term. They wanted scalps, and the prosecutors gave them.
Understatement of the year. The pressure and fairness, if we can be fair to the prosecutors here, the pressure was enormous. National pressure. We have got to get convictions in this case. But there were some that said it wasn't a good case to begin with. The statements didn't line up, no DNA evidence. But the pressure, Richard, that the prosecutors faced was enormous, and they decided ultimately to go forward with the case.
I mean, we played a little bit of it at the end, but I know sometimes I've heard from people, well, they get exonerated, they get a nice big check. What happened to those kids, but Wise in particular? He shows up just to give support at the precinct. He wasn't even called to be there for his buddy, and then he gets sent away with big boys at the adult prisons, and I mean, destroyed life in more ways than I can ever describe. And the president then saying, let's kill them all, death penalty, and then after it all came out saying, I still stand by it. I've seen Linda Fairstein's statement saying she still believes that it was a good conviction for the 5. What about the other prosecutors that were involved then? Do they still stand by the convictions now?
Well, there's only one in question, Elizabeth Lederer. There have been calls for District Attorney Vance of Manhattan to fire her from her full-time job as an assistant district attorney. He has declined to do so. In the Netflix series, she, if it is to be completely believed, Lederer expresses doubt to Linda Fairstein, hey, this is not all adding up. We need this, and this. But ultimately, Lederer went forward as the lead prosecutor. Corey Wise, I want to just focus on him for 1 second. You brought him up, Richard. You made the good points about he got it the worst. The treatment of him was so bad, from one extreme to the other, being brutalized, that part 4 of this Netflix series, which is heartbreaking, half of the series is dedicated to how brutalized he was in prison. And then from being brutalized, from almost completely losing his mind in solitary confinement. That was the only way they could protect him as a 16-year-old young man thrown in prison, convicted of rape with other grown men.
You guys, as I mentioned, had been on both sides of the aisle, but you were prosecutors at the time. Linda Fairstein has been a guest on this program. She has a lot of things within her career, including being one of the most vocal to process the rape kits. That's what we've spoken to. But should she, could she, what should she have known then, or what should she have asked then? And it's for all you guys. I'll start with you, Jimmy. That a good prosecutor would have done. I know there was pressures. Somebody wanted somebody for this horrific case, But was there a miscarriage of justice, not just done to these men, but done by the DA's office?
Well, there's absolutely no question there was. And what she should have done was not succumb to that pressure. And she should have been a true prosecutor that looks away from the pressure and looks towards doing justice. What she should have asked were the very questions that were being posed to her vehemently, repeatedly. It's not as though she had to figure it out and ask those questions. People were in her face telling her, look, there's a problem here. We shouldn't go that fast. And you know, the notion of let's round up all the black kids in the park because they're all suspects, what should she have done? Is incredible. And quite frankly, it does not surprise me that to this day, in the face of a confession by somebody else's DNA being matched
a serial
to that
rapist
crime,
who raped again after that incident in
and
the
with
park,
no
yeah.
DNA for these 5 kids, it still doesn't surprise me that she stands by it as a good conviction, because I don't think she'll ever.
You remember what it was like
Say
back then,
different.
right?
I do remember that. It was before I went to law school. But you know, the bigger question is if you want a system where you can actually sit people who are their children in a room with professional detectives who are going to question them for hours and hours. Now, in all fairness, you had a victim in this case that was not going to pick them out of a lineup. She couldn't do it. So you had the difficult job of these detectives who clearly went over the line and did something to these boys. That,
At her direction, though.
Well,
did this in many ways change, Mayo, how interrogations happen, particularly from minors, in terms of counts? I know you know the system. You've told us every week here about the imperfections in the system, and there certainly still are problems. But could 5 kids be treated the same way today, given the attention that happens? Like, you deny them 30 hours, even access to food or water. You tell them they're going to go home, and then all of a sudden, you know, they find out they're locked up and they're going away, you know, to some of the worst places they can go?
Absolutely, and our highest courts validate that, and they have decisions sometimes when you have people that are held for 2 or 3 days, and courts going on each of those 3 days in the same building downstairs, and the courts either decline to actually address it and give what's called a memorandum decision, where they simply make a finding without getting into the facts. But the other thing is there's no accountability on the part of prosecutors, and very limited with respect to police. So if you told Linda Fairstein that she's going to now go serve the time each year that those kids have served, I don't think she would have done that. So you have people who know in their heart that this is not the right person. And actually, she served a tremendous disservice to the people who were harmed by this guy later. Because maybe if instead of saying close by arrest, as she's out there actually orchestrating, you know, the arrest and coming up with the theory, which normally detectives do that, not the prosecutor. You don't tell them what angle to take a photo from and where somebody came from. Instead of that, maybe these people wouldn't have been victims.
And I will only say one thing when you bring it full circle. They were victimized first by a miscarriage of justice. Then, after everything that happened, to have not only the folks involved in the case not acknowledge, even in the face of evidence, that they were wrongly convicted, but to have a then private citizen take a full-page ad out saying that we should kill them all, and then when it's proven, at least, first of all, they were exonerated, but there should be at least reasonable doubt, to double down as the commander-in-chief, as the person who tells everyone he's in charge of the Justice Department. For that to be the statement coming from on high, I think is as much of an indictment on the man as anything I can think of. All right, when we come back, Paul Manafort, he's being held in Manhattan right now, but he could have been sent to Rikers Island. In fact, many of us thought that's where he'd be now. We're going to show you who actually intervened to keep him out of Rikers and the implications of that move after this.